Welcome, everybody. I'm joined today by Peter Beyer from the World Health Organization. And Peter and I, you and I got to know each other 3 or 4 years ago, I think, as part of the Pipeline Project. So I recall this. That's what I remember the first time we met. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, we even met before in one of the Drive AB meetings that was taking place at the Geneva Hospital. That's, I think, where we met first time. It was the Drive AB project with Stefan Habert running it.
Kickoff.
And that's where you were there. And I think you were still in industry.
Right. So that would have been 2014 when we were kicking off the Drive AB work. There we go. So 6 or 7 years now. So you have an interesting background. You're another one of those lawyers who's wandered into the space of AMR. Just tell us about yourself and how you got here and why you're putting your time and energy into AMR.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, John. It's really a great honor. And as you said, I mean, it's weird. It's sometimes I'm a bit scared because, I mean, of course, as a lawyer, you don't really have an appropriate training to do evidence-based things. So how did I end up in doing, I mean, fostering research and development of new antibiotics? I used to be a delegate for the Swiss government, representing Switzerland at the WHO, and I was responsible for everything which was concerning patents, intellectual property, health, access to drugs, human rights. So a very political issue around research, of course, versus access. And then I did this for a couple of years during negotiations in WTO, WHO, WIPO, free trade agreements. And then the Secretariat asked me whether I would like to join the WHO because they were actually in need of an intellectual property expert. So I joined the Secretariat and started to work in that area.
That's a lot like, Kevin Otterson tells a story about the fact that he got interested in this because he was thinking about IP. I don't think he's really formally an IP lawyer the way you are, but you came into this because of the quirkiness. There's this quirky property of antibiotics and intellectual property.
Yeah, and when I joined WHO, of course, there was always, I mean, intellectual property was always relevant about access, like, what do we do with high-priced products? How can we get generics early into the market? But on the other hand, of course, there was also this issue about how can we trigger innovation? How can we incentivize innovation in areas where the patents don't bring any incentives because the companies won't make money on the market? And the typical example was neglected tropical diseases. So that was my area, figuring out new ways and how can we actually develop drugs for neglected tropical diseases where we knew intellectual property, you can give them 50 years of patent term, you will have zero investment because there's no market. And it was about either you have actually neglected patient population, meaning poor people in poor countries very often, or of course with the you can also have very, very small patient populations. And then we had this commission, this was presided by Group Dreyfus, a commission of intellectual property and public health, and they said that antibiotics is actually a similar issue and it's getting worse. And so, I mean, and that's how it started. And then we did this global action plan on antimicrobial resistance. And that is where for the first time, actually, WHO, really, there was one chapter on, well, the economics, they don't work out for antibiotics either.
So what year would that have been when did you join the WHO and kind of trace that through time relative to, 2009, we had the Swedish conference. 2012, I think, was the year the WHO, the World Health Day, was focused on antibiotics. So where were you in that pathway?
I joined in 2009. I joined in 2009 WHO, and then in 2000, and then we started in parallel looking actually what can we do to foster investment into new antibiotic research. And we try to actually use the experience from neglected tropical diseases. And that is why we also started to set up GARDP. because we knew from DNDi, one thing WHO can do, we create a foundation, we try to find money, and we set them to work. And that is something we knew we can do within a couple of years without actually having the member states to approve it formally, while other things like the global R&D treaty or big market incentive mechanism, we would have needed all member states to agree. So we thought in the meantime, let's at least set up a specific foundation, GARDP, to actually do something until we wait for actually, let's say, the big bang for the market entry reward or another pull mechanism.
Yeah. It's interesting to reflect on how long you started 2009. That's kind of when I got serious this 2009. So now we're 11 years into that and seeing all this momentum. So tell us a little bit about GARDP. I know you were deeply involved in starting that. When, sort of remind me the timeline of GARDP. It all kind of blends together in my head after a while.
I mean, I can't remember when we started. We started probably in 2014, before the Global Action Plan was adopted. We reviewed a couple of mechanisms. We reviewed Thomas Pogge's idea of a health impact fund. We reviewed, I think Novartis had put up under Paul Hurling, they had actually an interesting idea for a funding mechanism. There was James Love, who presented the idea of an R&D treaty. So we had a meeting where we actually looked at what are the different options. And then we thought, well, let's go for something we know we can set up within a relatively short period of time. And that worked out. And then in parallel, of course, we worked on other incentive mechanisms, and also, I mean, of course, all the work we do around looking at antibiotics in development. And I remember also one big push was the G7 under the German presidency. And I'm biased, of course, because I'm German, but the Germans, they really put AMR high on the agenda. And they had promised then in the G7 that they wanted a priority pathogens list. That was it. And they said they had promised it to the G7. And then they came to WHO and said, they came to me and said, Peter, you did, I mean, not me personally, but you did this list of blueprint pathogens, the pathogens with pandemic potential. We had done this after the first Ebola outbreak. We had systematically looked at all the pathogens with pandemic potential to list them, whether it was Nipah, Rift Valley fever, Lassa, other stuff, to then set up CEPI to actually develop the vaccine candidates for each of these pathogens to be actually better prepared. And then the Germans said, like, you need to do this for AMR. And then I said, well, look, again, I said, I'm a lawyer. I can't do that. But they actually pledged the money, and then my colleague Nicola Magrini, with his colleagues who were running the essential medicines list, they did this priority pathogens list with Evelina Tacconelli as a consultant from Italy. And I did actually with my team, we looked at the antibiotics who were in clinical development. And that is how actually we had a more systematic approach, because we said, we do what we did in emergency preparedness. We look at the pathogens, we look at what is the biggest threat, and then we look at, do we have the necessary tools to counter this threat? And if not, let's set up a foundation to develop what we need. So that is basically the thinking in terms of, if you think result chain, how it could work. And it's, let's say, it's imperfect, but at least you have a certain logic behind, and it's also something. I remember the UK, they were after Germany the next G7 presidency, but it was followed by UK, and they came with the O'Neill report. So they had a really good, I mean, it was high on the agenda for two subsequent presidencies.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I forgot about that.
Yeah. And I have to say, both governments, it's really, I mean, these are two of the countries, they walk the talk. I mean, they didn't only put it on the agenda and said, you need to do something, they also came up with money.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, what actually makes things happen.
Yeah, so they were back to back. And also that's when the AMR hub got created, right? With the German G7 presidency, the AMR hub came into play. Yeah. So let's actually, you've pointed at two things there, GARDP and the priority pathogen list. And to the priority pathogen list, I think I would add your ongoing work with pipeline reviews. And so let's actually talk a little bit about each one of them independently. So, and I think it probably makes good sense to start first with the bugs. So talk to me a little bit about the priority pathogen list. And the first version of it was in 2017.
17.
What's going on with that? And a little bit about the pipeline reviews that you're continuing to do as well.
Yeah, so we did the first list in 2017, and it's really a list of bacteria which identifies those we think are the biggest public health threats in terms of emerging resistance, matched against, do we have treatments or are we running out of treatments? And so it's really priority list for research and development. That was the purpose, and we were very positively surprised that this is really a list that companies or the private sector is using when they actually look for research priorities in the areas they look. And if you are in the list with your project, then you have better chances of getting funding. And the same, I mean, you know it, CARBX, GARDP, they all look at the priority pathogens. So we are really, I mean, positively surprised that these kind of priority setting exercises, they have a real impact. And I mean, we knew it from TB. We had done it for TB once. We had identified not products, but research questions. And we had monitored the impact it has on the flows of research money. And it has a huge impact. This is one of the things that I think WHO can really do.
Yeah.
And that's where what we are good at. We are not good at doing research ourselves necessarily, but to identify priorities using experts, using transparent processes, that's what we can do. So this is the priority pathogens list. We can see it in, as you mentioned, we do this monitoring of the clinical pipeline and the preclinical pipeline. And in the preclinical pipeline, we see it very clearly that the projects we pick up, they are focusing on WHO and CDC identified priorities. That is also something to say. The CDC list has a similar huge impact on what gets funded, obviously, because the US...
Pretty similar bugs too. I mean, overall, the two lists they overlap mostly.
And so now we hopefully in 2022, we will have a new look at the list and see what we can do to improve it. One thing that you I think, as one of our experts in the group, also you raised it. It's the question on, can we only focus on bugs, on pathogens, or should we link it to syndromes? Because it's not, I mean, the blueprint we did for the pathogens with pandemic potential, it's usually you have one pathogen, you have one disease.
Right.
Easy. For bacteria, different. You have one bacteria, you have lots of possible infections, and then they can be caused by different bacteria. And so it's more complicated, and probably we need to add another layer of, let's say, information to that list.
Yeah, the idea of saying that, maybe you really want something for childhood pneumonia, and that needs to be oral. It needs to be pediatric, that's sort of a thing. So you said 2022, maybe for an update of the WHO priority pathogen list. And are we going to be seeing new pipeline update data? I mean, you're doing that about once a year, once every 18 months now?
I just got feedback from my communications department. We are doing a press conference on 14th or 15th of April to release the new report, where you are part of the expert group. So that's fantastic. We are also going to release a report on the vaccines in development in hopefully before summer. So I think that's will be a really interesting addition to see for which bacterial infections we have vaccines in development and in which stage are they, because that of course should be looked at in sync with the therapeutics. And it also will give us a more realistic picture, I think, from what we can expect. And because I'm not sure the AMR community always has a really realistic expectation with how many vaccines for which syndromes we are going to see. And also, I mean, a big challenge is, of course, in a very busy vaccination schedule, what can you add to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I just actually yesterday spent some time preparing a newsletter about the new framework. The WHO has just released a framework for action on vaccines, focusing really on bacterial vaccines. And that caused me to re-review the Wellcome Trust report from 2018 when they looked at the question of, okay, lots of vaccines you could wish for, which ones actually are plausible scientifically? And one of the things that struck me about that was the bacteria where a vaccine looks like it's perhaps within reach. It's really pretty small. It's the enteric, gram-negatives, E. coli, Shigella, and then, maybe a couple of other bacteria, maybe Staph aureus, maybe Pseudomonas, but lots and lots of other bacteria. Vaccine, at least the review in 2018 said, the science looks really, really hard, and it's not clear that putting a lot of money into this is the best use of our finite resources. You might let some stuff bubble along, but fascinating. So I'm about to have a newsletter that reviews that, and because you've just released those reports, or the WHO, somebody, the Immunization Agenda 2030 team has just released those reports. Really, really strong work there. Okay, so if we take all that and feed it back, talk to me about GARDP. First, spell out the acronym for everybody, and then tell me how it's constructed and what it's doing and where you're going with it.
Yeah, so GARDP stands for Global Antibiotic R&D Partnership. And it's a foundation that we set up together with DNDi. So we are co-founder, and DNDi is the other co-founder. And they were hosted initially by DNDi, who are specialized on actually developing new treatments for tropically neglected diseases. And GARDP is meant to mirror them and to develop new antibacterial treatments. And of course, in line with the WHO priority setting. So we are working very closely together with them to also shape their R&D agenda. And they speak, for example, they have a phase 3 treatment for gonorrhea in development. And they work very closely with my colleagues in WHO who works on sexually transmitted infections. So it's really in sync, and we try to do the same for what they do on neonatal sepsis, so that they work really in synchrony with our department on mother and child health.
Right, and so what big projects do you see them being interested in and delivering on? You've mentioned a couple of them, neonatal sepsis and gonorrhea. That's a lot for a small group. I think GARDP is, it's not like it's a huge giant corporation. It's a handful of folks, and so that delivering on just that would be great. What's the long-term trajectory of GARDP? What's your vision for what else it might do down the road?
Yeah, maybe you do your next fireside talk with Manika. He will tell you. But
he's on my list. He's on my list.
Yeah, that's very good. They have this strategy 5 by 25, so they are very ambitious, and of course they don't do it alone. They partner with mostly small companies, so both on the gonorrhea drug as well as on the other drug that is in phase 3 for serious resistant infections. They also partner with the company. I think a lot will depend on funding. I mean, let's be honest. It's even if you do it as foundation, it costs a huge amount of money, And even if they are in phase 3, the risks of failure are high, and and they will need more money. I mean, we're happy that the government of Japan joined as a funder, and they're also on the board. But we do definitely need more sustainable financing of this and other R&D mechanisms. And I see, I mean, whether it's CARBEX or GARDP, I always see the same countries. I see the UK, I see Germany, I see a bit of Switzerland, the Netherlands, Wellcome Trust, but I also see, I hope I didn't forget any big funder, huh? South Africa is the US, of course, they give money to partner, but there are also a lot of countries who don't. And we need a broader base of countries that are engaging, and that's what unfortunately it's, well, and maybe it's also on neglected tropical diseases. You got more money when it became an issue where the ministries of development cooperation are interested because they have the bigger budget. The ministries of health, they usually have not a big budget for R&D. While we still facing the issue that many agencies for development cooperation, they don't see antimicrobial resistance as, their big issue. And even for the Gates Foundation, it was well, this is also an issue for US, Switzerland, so why should we pay for it if resistance is also an issue for the rich developed countries? They should pay for it. So that is actually hindering access to certain money pots.
Well, and that, I think, leads us then into the discussion of, I'm going to say, the whole question of push-pull and particularly delinked incentives. And, there's starting to be some strong action in Europe about the idea of providing delinked incentives and encouraging countries to participate in some, I'm going to call it loosely, pro rata economic fashion. Can you talk a little bit about that and your perspectives on it from the WHO view? I think it's interesting to realize from one of the things I've learned in my journey through all this is that you really want to get inside the head of the other groups, the other stakeholders that are around the table, and gaining an insight into, how the mind of WHO works when it thinks about this kind of thing. There's not exactly one, it's human beings, of course, but the notion of what's the view on this? In a way, this is where you came from with intellectual property, this whole your starting point about, who owns what and how should we be paying for it. So talk a little bit about delinked models. And then after that, I want to jump into the really interesting new stewardship and access planning guide that came out with CARBEX and Wellcome Trust. So delinked models first.
Yeah, the delinked models, it's very interesting. When I used to negotiate for Switzerland, delinkage was still, that was a term that was introduced by Jamie Love, and you would not want to see it in any official WHO resolution. At least people were very worried. What does it mean? Today it's mainstream, and even countries like Switzerland, US, and even industry is actually not against it. And definitely it makes sense, in particular for antibiotics. Delinking the revenue from the volume means that you don't have to actually use huge amounts of a new antibiotic to actually make money. And that makes so much sense for antibiotics. It's actually really the blueprint. But of course, the current model is, there are two ways. Either you actually have a very small volume and a very, very high price per pack, per pill, or you have a huge volume and you can lower the price. And we need to move away from it and have something which is in between, because we don't want a reserve antibiotic to cost $500,000. I mean, nobody wants that.
Right.
And that is something which I think is really, really interesting And I'm very encouraged by these pilots that we are seeing in the UK and in Sweden. It's a bit different because it's more on access to existing drugs than incentivizing R&D. But still, it's an interesting model, and we need to try out more of those, and we need different ones because the way that countries are purchasing medicines is very different between, let's say, the UK and Germany, and how they are fixing prices, and they are very allergic also to harmonization, even on a European level. So unfortunately, it makes it more complicated, but maybe it's also a competition of systems. You know, if we have a competition of systems and 10 countries try something out, and we would then, settle on which works best, that would be fantastic. If we try it out in different systems, in different reimbursement and procurement systems, I think we should come to something which maybe is not ideal but is workable, and together maybe is going to actually provide an incentive to the market. Because I'm convinced that it will be very difficult if antibiotics really become like neglected tropical diseases. And we always would rely on public money and taxpayer money and foundations financing the R&D. It will be very difficult in the long run. So I think if we would have a sustainable system where those who use these antibiotics, and you came up with, Kevin, with this how do you call it, the fire extinguisher model. This is like an insurance. You don't want to use it. You are happy to pay every year your fee for the insurance, and you're happy if your house doesn't burn down. Great. Yeah. And that's like antibiotics. Let's pay all together in one pot, or not maybe in separate pots, and not use them sparsely. And I think if we can get to that, and that would be fantastic. What we also learned from the neglected tropical diseases with our member states, if you come with this, we do one big pot of money and everybody puts money in the pot, and let's say the UN is managing the money, it's not very attractive to many member states because they give away the money, they have no control. It's an opaque political institution managing the money, not necessarily efficiently. It's not we need a decentralized model where countries actually decide where their money goes. It's fine. I always say today, it doesn't matter where you put the money. Put it in CARBX, in GARDP, in JPI AMR, in the global AMR hub. Choose what you want to do, but do something.
Yeah, and I think we have to be grateful to the UK and Sweden for trying something. They both just said, we're going to do it, and it's not going to be right, it's not going to be perfect, but it will be, and we can all learn from that. So I'm hoping the Pasteur Act in the US gets to the same place. It will be a partial solution, but one from which we can learn, and it's a model that other countries could look at and adapt. And I think you just added something interesting to my understanding about countries not having had a great experience in the past with putting a lot of money into a pot and hoping that would come back to them in a positive way. I can see how there might have been stories like that, and that leads to desire to not do it that way. People would like to have their own strategy. And I was fascinated by the recent Stewardship and Access Planning Guide that came out. The CARBX worked with Wellcome, and clearly the WHO. A lot of people contributed to that. It seemed to me to fit very neatly into building out some of addressing some of the concerns about providing delinked support to companies. You have any comments on that? And sort of teach us a little bit about how that worked inside the WHO and how people think about it now, and what that did for everybody's insight around using delinked models.
Yeah, I think this is really a good piece of work, and it shows also how collaborative the space of AMR is. And because, as you said, many people contributed, which it was led by CARBEX, Wellcome Trust. They made it happen, but they consulted very widely. And it's really important. From all our experience in financing R&D, we do know that you have to get certain conditions in the contracts very early. For CARBEX, it's a challenge because preclinical is very, very early, and these are small companies, and you can't ask them to actually commit to access plans that would cost them millions if they don't earn millions. They just can't do it.
Right.
It's not possible. But we do know that it's really important to get certain conditions in the contracts, and that is also, for example, that is something which I do think wasn't ideal with what governments did on financing COVID-19 vaccines. If you give money to whoever to do something, and you have to actually put clauses in your contracts on how much will this vaccine cost, how will you set the price, who has access to technology, and who will have access to underlying IP. Yep. That is really important. And when we are still on the board of CEPI, this was always one of our big points, that we wanted to make sure that if CEPI is going to fund vaccine development, that they make sure that they get it right in their contractual agreements. And I know it's not easy because, of course, for the companies it's not attractive. It might dilute the attractiveness for other investors if they do not fully own the compound they are working on. So there are all kinds of course, economically consequences. But so I do think that what CARBEX and Wellcome Trust did, the stewardship and access plan that the companies they are working with, they have to work on, I think it's really excellent.
Yeah, and it's a good example. It lays out what a company can do to facilitate stewardship and access. And if a company has a delinked revenue related to the product, it really should be fine as long as that's covered. And I also was interested in the way that it points at the things that the other members of the ecosystem need to do. We've talked in our conversation today about national action plans, and the countries now have to do the right thing with making the antibiotic available in the right way. You want to use it as a reserve antibiotic, but you want to use it when you need it. Don't hold back because suddenly it shouldn't cost too much to use it when it's the correct thing to do. And I think that's be interesting to see how all that plays out. Super. Well, this has been fun. I want to say thank you for making time to chat with me today. And thank you for what you've done. I think it's interesting to hear and think about how WHO can and has really moved the needle by laying out clear priorities so that everybody could line up on them. And you're right, that priority pathogen list, that was a big deal for everybody. Here's the list. Make these fire extinguishers, not those fire extinguishers. Something that I say a lot to folks. What we want is one of the fire extinguishers on that list. Okay, let's go for that. So I just want to say, thank you to you and your colleagues for what you've done. It's just been outstanding. And I guess are there any other topics that we've not covered today? Anything else that you'd like to throw in? Any other current perspectives?
Let me think. Yes, I think thank you first, John. It was great. And thank you actually for what you have done and for pushing us, because also we need sometimes to be pushed. And we also need your support, support from you and others. What did we miss? I think it's not an R&D issue, but we do see that on existing antibiotics, we have an increasing number of shortages even in Europe. And it's also an economic issue. GSK just is closing down manufacturing plants in the UK, and they sold the brands to Sandoz. There is a huge concentration going on in the market. Sanofi is actually putting the API production in a separate company. The generic antibiotic market is under a lot of economic pressure as well. And we know that generic companies, of course, they will also look at their portfolio. And every year when they put in the portfolio new products, they also delist products, maybe that are economically not that attractive, and antibiotics are very far down on the list. And we can see it in Europe. We just had a meeting with hospital pharmacists in France, in Switzerland, Germany, Denmark, to ask them, what do you do in your procurement practices to overcome the challenge of these frequent shortages of antibiotics, typically antibiotics that parenteral products you use in hospitals. And we want to work with them on actually coming up with strategies how we can make this a more sustainable market, a more secure market, which also means probably that you have to pay more in exchange for more supply security. And I think that is this is something which is now high on the agenda because of COVID-19. But we had the issue before, and we still have the problem.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to underestimate the challenge of the supply chain, particularly for a drug that's an injectable, a sterile injectable product. But even just a tablet, the supply chains are subtle, I think is the right word for it, and often a little bit fragile, because when you're starting out with a drug, you typically build a sort of a point-to-point supply chain, and you don't have parallelism because you can't afford it. You don't know for sure what you're going to need. So that's actually could be a really interesting. We did a conversation on that at one of the recent ASM-ESPN meetings, but that would be something that could be worth spending some more time on. Is there going to be? Are you kind of queuing up to do some work on a paper or a global framework for manufacturing? Is that because WHO again to take advantage of your bully pulpit?
I'm actually have a project that is funded by the European Commission, where we are helping France. It's a 3-year project, and I have a full-time pharmacist working on it. We are trying to figure out measures that France can take to actually tackle the root causes of shortages of antibiotics in France. And we, of course, it's not limited to France. We speak with the Norwegians, we speak with others, and we also involved in some of the European work streams. So yes, I think we can, we surely are going to publish about it and try to share the ideas.
Good. I think that understanding that manufacturing pharmaceuticals is not like manufacturing nails or bricks. It's an art, and it's an expensive art, and we really do have to take care of our supply. Okay, fantastic. I'm just gonna say thanks, and have a great rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you in person at some point in the next year, COVID notwithstanding. So until then, again, thank you. Have a lovely day.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for having me. And yes, second half of the year, maybe it's possible. Let's see whether we can make it.
Looking forward to it. All right, we'll see you. Wow, what fun to get to visit with Peter today. And gotta again thank the technology. He's in Switzerland. I'm in the US. We can have this free-ranging conversation across video. Fabulous. And thank all of you for joining in and listening. If you look below the video, there's links to various other resources that you might find useful. And as always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Stay safe.